From the point when I started backpacking to the first couple of years afterwards, I always used a hammock camping kit for my entire sleep system. And I would take it on kayaking trips with me. I'd take it camping and backpacking and all that kind of stuff. And then I kind of just decided not to do hammock camping anymore. Today, I'm going to be breaking down exactly why I stopped doing hammock camping and using hammocks for my sleep system. And I moved over to tents, and I'm going to go through exactly why I did that, what the thinking was behind it, and all the reasons for it, and all that kind of stuff. So that's what we're going to get into today. So like I said, when I first started backpacking and going on kind of overnight trips, I used hammocks for everything. Part of that was because it was just easy. I already owned a hammock, so I kind of just like used that as my sleep system. And then also I just thought it was like really light and really simple to pack. I enjoyed sleeping in a hammock, all that kind of stuff. It just felt like I was kind of more in nature when I was sort of sleeping in a hammock instead of a tent and that sort of thing. And so for the first probably like 3 or 4 years that I was doing these trips, that's actually all I used was just a hammock sleeping system. And the funny thing is I didn't even use like a perfect hammock sleeping system. I really kind of ended up just using like an Eno hammock and then no underquilt, no top quilt. It was like an Eno hammock with a sleeping bag. And then after a while, I put like a sleeping pad underneath me. But for a while, I didn't even have a pad underneath me. I just had like the sleeping bag and the hammock. If you've ever slept in a hammock, you know why that would be a bad idea. We can talk about that later, of course, as well. But that's all I really had at first. So I like started with that, and I kind of like upgraded my kit as I went with hammock camping. But then I just switched over to using tents. So there are a few different reasons why I went from using a hammock and like doing like a hammock setup to a tent setup, and we're just going to go through all of those right now. The first one was the setup time and kind of the complexity of what it took to actually set up your hammock. You have to find 2 trees that are actually next to each other in such a spacing that it makes sense. And you can kind of like use like straps and that kind of stuff to like shorten how much length you need and all that kind of thing. But you really, at the end of the day, had to be looking for like 2 trees or 2 objects that were roughly a good distance apart and like even with each other to be able to string up a hammock. And that just became this sort of complex thing that was a lot more difficult than I was hoping it would be. So even when I was doing the kayaking trips, we'd be on the river and we'd be going down the river. And if we were like 5 or 8 miles away from where we were supposed to be camping that night, we'd start looking along the shoreline for trees to see, you know, okay, do these spots look good to set up a hammock or 4 hammocks? Because all of us were using hammocks at the time. So you had to find a spot to like string up 4 hammocks and you can stack them, but then it gets more complicated with people getting in and out and all that kind of stuff. So it just became sort of this complex game of like, okay, 5 or 8 miles before we're supposed to stop, we're looking for places to stop anyway. And then sometimes you'd be looking the whole time, you wouldn't find anything. So then you get past where you're supposed to camp and you're still looking, and you just kind of have to find the best thing that works. And it was always this game of like, it's kind of stressful game of like trying to find the perfect spot to set up your hammock that became just a lot more complicated than it needed to be for me. And the same thing for, like I was talking about kayaking, but also the same thing for backpacking. So it's even worse with backpacking because I get like 5 miles from where I was supposed to be camping that night. And then I would just start looking for like places to set up my hammock. If I found one, I would just take it, because who knows if I'm going to find one that's actually at my campsite area. Who knows about that? And also, there's only so many places to string up a hammock. So if other people are on that camp area and they might be using it for hammocks, yada, yada. Sometimes you get to your campsite, there'd be nothing for that whole span. So then you have to go past your campsite. And now there were times I was even setting up in the dark or at dusk and then trying to get cooking and everything like that, just because it took me so long to find a campsite where I could string up 1 hammock or 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever it was. But the complexity of that whole situation just kind of got like out of hand after a while. And at some point, the complexity of using a hammock overruled the ease of what I thought using a hammock would be and the comfort of it. So it just actually became less complex and a lot easier to manage to bring a tent with me instead of a hammock at that point, because a tent can pretty much go anywhere. All you have to have is like the footprint of your tent and slightly even ground and you're good to go. The other thing I will say about stringing up a hammock and trying to find trees is that it works if you're in a forested area, but a lot of times my backpacking trips take me above the tree line, which means there basically are no trees, or if you're in a desert area or whatever it is, but you have to have the presence of trees or like objects that you can kind of like sling a hammock on to actually make a hammock work. Otherwise you're sleeping in the dirt. And I just didn't like the unsteadiness and the insecurity of knowing like, am I actually gonna be like sleeping off the ground today? In a shelter, like in a hammock, or am I just going to be like sleeping on the dirt? So thankfully I never had to do it, but there was actually this like really weird added element of stress that I didn't expect when I was hammock camping, that I always was like looking for places to put my hammock up. And yeah, it just wasn't worth it after a while. The next thing is why I originally started using a hammock was because of just like the weight and the bulkiness of a tent felt sort of too much for me. So if I just had like a small hammock and I just had a small like rain fly for my hammock, and I had just had like, I didn't have to have a like a ground cover at that point, all that kind of stuff. I was like, oh, I could just have like these like little items that work for me, and they pack in really tightly and really easily. And so I thought that it'd be easier to use a hammock to go on my backpacking trips for my sleep system, because they would just pack in smaller. But once you start looking at the actual system here, you have, so like this is all of the stuff that is required for a hammock to go up well. So this is like the rain fly for the hammock, this is the hammock itself, and these are the tarps, the straps for the hammock. So you have, right here is basically what you would get instead of a tent. It's like the same kind of shelter and cover, but it's not, but we'll talk about that later. But at first I kind of thought like, oh, I'm just bringing this. This is really simple and easy. And then I realized, oh man, I need a rain fly. So I brought a rain fly. And then, well, of course you gotta be able to string your hammock up. So you have to have straps. And all of these things, you can get like thinner straps and easier to use straps. You can use like whoopee slings, or you can get like a smaller rain fly, or you can get like a lighter hammock, all that kind of stuff. But at some point, if you're going to be kind of lightening down all of your hammock gear anyway, it's actually cheaper to get to lighten down your tent to the same degree, and you get a lot more coverage. So we'll talk about that in a minute. I did just want to show you real quickly here. So this is the tent that I commonly use. This has the poles in the stuff sack, but normally I would take the poles out of the stuff sack and then scrunch the tent down and then have the poles separate. But if you actually look at kind of the sizing here, it's about the same. So I wasn't really saving any space at the end of the day with hammock camping. I will also say just the weight of all the items. So I thought that I would save on the bulk in my bag, and that just ended up not being true. And then the weight itself wasn't that much of a difference between the tent and the entire hammock setup. And I'll put the numbers up here on the screen for you so you can see that. But yeah, once again, I was just realizing that like all the things I thought I was saving by using a hammock setup, I wasn't actually saving. The next reason that I switched from a hammock to a tent, and I've already kind of touched on this, but essentially like the weather protection is not nearly as much in a hammock as it is with the tent. So even if you have your rain fly and you have it done well, you're actually still just like the rain can kind of get under the fly a lot easier than it can in a tent, in my opinion. So I was still there's times that I would camp out or like backpack in the rain and that kind of stuff. And I was still getting wet in my hammock, even though I had a rain fly on and all that kind of stuff. And I was still dealing with a lot of issues with like the weather and all of that. So I didn't feel as kind of secure and safe in the hammock at the end of the day when I was using it, as opposed to a tent that I feel actually sort of encapsulated and protected from all the different things. Another thing I'm going to add on to that is just like a little like point B is the mosquitoes and bugs and stuff. So you can get like a bug net that goes with your hammock, but once again, it's just like another item that you have to add to it. And then you kind of are protected from bugs, but they can actually still, as you're laying in your hammock, they'll still kind of like find where you are through the fabric of the hammock and still get you. So that's a really big pain and just something I don't want to deal with. So the bugs will still get you if you're in your hammock, even if you have a bug mesh, because they can kind of come under and find you through the fabric like that. So bugs, no thanks. The next reason that I went from a hammock to a tent was actually just like the way that you store your gear and stow all your stuff. When I was in a hammock, I would put everything underneath my hammock as best as I could, like my shoes and my backpack and all that. My food would be somewhere else, of course, but like my backpack and my shoes and just all that kind of stuff would be like under my hammock as best as I could. But once again, especially with weather, or if you had some kind of runoff from, you know, a storm or whatever it is, and it gets wet, or like the dew comes up and gets everything wet that's on the ground, that would be the case with my gear. So you can put your hammock or you can put your backpack up in a tree or in a branch, whatever, but then you still want your shoes to be close access. And those were getting wet all the time. So it's just really inconvenient after a while with how you like stow your gear compared to a tent that usually has some kind of vestibule where it feels like they're kind of protected and secure and that kind of stuff. It's like within a zipper, so you don't feel like somebody's going to grab it or anything like that as much. So once again, it was just a thing with gear storage that it didn't make as much sense as a tent after a while. The next one is actually just the comfort of it. So maybe it's my old age, but of course I even thought this in my 20s. But at first with the hammock, it was really comfortable. And then as I slept through the night, I would never get as good of sleep in a hammock as I would in a tent, mostly because I was kind of banana shaped. And you can pull the hammock really tight and make it as straight as you can, but it sort of loosens over time anyway. And I would end up still just sort of being banana shaped. So you have to sleep on your back essentially in a hammock. Whereas in a tent, you can sleep on your back or your side or your stomach because you're basically just flat. But in a hammock, there are like ways to sleep on your side, kind of. But really the back is like your only really good option with the hammock. And even then you still just sort of end up like this. And that just, once again, got really uncomfortable over time. So I learned to enjoy sleeping flat in a tent a lot more than sleeping oddly shaped in a hammock. The next one is actually the condensation and moisture problem. So what I mean by this is sort of related to the weather thing, but you have all this condensation that comes from your body heat, and then it would go up on the rainfly and then drip down on you. So you basically get like dew inside of your rainfly, which is not fun. And I tried so many different ways to like make that not happen, but it still would. And then also condensation. So I talked about that with stowing your gear under the hammock and not feeling secure, and also it just getting wet with dew and all that kind of stuff. But it would also just sort of cover you in general because you're not fully covered inside the hammock. So you can have an under quilt that helps with heat and with moisture and that kind of stuff. You can have a top quilt that does the same thing, but you're just carrying more gear with you at that point to fix a problem that you could also fix for lighter and cheaper with a tent at that point. So yeah, condensation. The last one is the cost. So after a while, if you're trying to basically keep buying all this gear to make your hammock essentially feel like a tent, it's actually just cheaper at some point to go buy a tent that's about the same quality. And if you put the same amount of money into a tent or a hammock, to me, a tent is just going to be a lot more bang for your buck. So the last reason is cost. I went to a tent because for the money, I can get a tent that feels really good versus a hammock that no matter what, you're always going to end up banana shaped and kind of wet, and your gear is still going to be on the ground with no cover. So I showed it a second ago, but here is the tent that I often use. It's the Big Agnes Fly Creek HV UL2. This is the 2-person tent. You can get a 1-person. This is an older model because I've had it for years, but this is actually what I end up using quite a bit now. Just a lightweight, not ultralight, but a lightweight 2-person tent. And honestly, for me, it works a lot better than a hammock setup. I've done them both. I've slept in them both, all that kind of stuff. But for me, this just wins out. So all this to say that I actually do still, especially if I'm camping, I still bring a hammock with me because I love sitting in them and relaxing in them. I just don't want them to be my entire sleep system.